Sometimes the truth sounds so impossible that even those closest to you refuse to believe it. Sarah Martinez had spent 15 years building her reputation as a reliable naval communications officer, never missing a shift, never filing a false report, never giving anyone reason to doubt her word. But on one foggy Tuesday morning off the coast of San Diego, she witnessed something that would make everyone question everything they thought they knew about her character. What she saw through her binoculars that morning seemed to defy logic, physics, and everything the Navy had taught her about what was possible on the open ocean. When she reported it, her commanding officers didn't just dismiss her account. They launched an investigation into her mental stability, her service record, and her fitness for duty. Her colleagues began whispering behind her back. Her family started asking careful questions about her stress levels. Even her closest friends began to wonder if the pressure of military life had finally gotten to her. For 18 months, Sarah fought a lonely battle to prove that what she had witnessed was real. She faced disciplinary hearings, psychological evaluations, and the slow erosion of a career she had dedicated her life to building. Everyone was convinced she was either lying or losing her mind. Everyone except Admiral James Morrison, a decorated veteran who had seen enough in his 40-year career to know that sometimes the impossible is just the improbable waiting to be understood. When Admiral Morrison finally decided to take a closer look at Sarah's case, what he discovered would not only vindicate her completely, but would also expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of naval command, challenge everything the military thought it knew about ocean surveillance, and ultimately change the course of Sarah's life in ways she never could have imagined. This is the true story of how one woman's courage to speak the truth, even when no one believed her, led to one of the most significant discoveries in modern naval history. Sarah Martinez's alarm clock rang at 0430 hours, just like it had every morning for the past 3 years aboard the USS Constellation. As a senior communications specialist, she took pride in being the first to arrive at her post and the last to leave. The ship was conducting routine patrol operations 60 miles off the San Diego coast, and the morning fog hung thick over the Pacific like a gray blanket that seemed to muffle even the sounds of the ocean. She dressed quickly in her Navy working uniform, grabbed her coffee from the galley, and made her way to the communications center. The corridor was quiet except for the gentle hum of the ship's engines and the occasional footsteps of the night watch making their rounds. Sarah loved these early morning hours when the ship felt peaceful and the day full of possibilities. The communications center was her domain, filled with sophisticated radar equipment, radio systems, and monitoring devices that kept the ship connected to the outside world. As she settled into her station, she began the routine checks that had become second nature after 15 years of naval service. All systems showed green across the board, and the night watch reported nothing unusual during their shift. At 0547 hours, Sarah stepped outside onto the observation deck to get a visual assessment of weather conditions for the morning report. The fog was beginning to lift slightly, creating patches of visibility across the water. She raised her binoculars to scan the horizon, a habit that had served her well throughout her career. The ocean appeared calm, with gentle swells that caught the early morning light filtering through the mist. That's when she saw it. At first, Sarah thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. Through a gap in the fog, approximately 2 miles off the starboard bow, something was moving beneath the water surface. It wasn't the familiar silhouette of a whale or the distinctive wake of a submarine. This was something else entirely, something that made her pulse quicken and her hands tighten on the binoculars. The object appeared to be massive, easily the size of a naval destroyer, but it was moving in a way that defied everything Sarah knew about underwater vessels. It glided silently beneath the surface with an almost ethereal grace, leaving barely a ripple in its wake. Most unsettling of all, it seemed to be emitting a soft, pulsing light that she could detect even through the water and the morning mist. Sarah blinked hard and rubbed her eyes, thinking perhaps the early morning light was creating an optical illusion. But when she looked again, the object was still there, now moving in a slow, deliberate pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than the random movement of marine life or the mechanical progression of a conventional submarine. Her training kicked in immediately. Sarah grabbed her camera and began documenting what she was seeing, taking both still photographs and video recordings. She made note of the time, weather conditions, and the object's approximate position relative to the ship. Every detail might be important, and she had learned long ago that thorough documentation was the foundation of any credible report. As she watched, the object began to change direction, moving in a way that seemed to ignore the ocean currents and the natural physics of underwater movement. It executed turns that would be impossible for any known submarine, moving with a fluidity that reminded Sarah more of how a bird might fly through air than how a vessel should move through water. The communications officer in her knew she needed to report this immediately to the bridge, but something made her hesitate. She had built her career on reliability and sound judgment. What she was seeing challenged everything she knew about naval technology and ocean science. Would anyone believe her? Would they think she was suffering from fatigue or stress? Sarah forced herself to remain calm and professional. She continued to observe and document for another 12 minutes, during which time the object performed maneuvers that became increasingly impossible to explain. At one point, it seemed to accelerate to a speed that should have created massive turbulence and noise, yet the water remained eerily calm. At another moment, it appeared to change its depth rapidly without the gradual ascent or descent that would be required for any known underwater vessel. Finally, at 0603 hours, the object simply vanished. Not in the way a submarine might submerge deeper, but as if it had simply ceased to exist. One moment Sarah could see its form moving through the water. The next moment there was nothing but empty ocean. She continued to watch the area for another 15 minutes, but the object did not reappear. With her heart still racing, Sarah returned to the communications center and
There's no
began
room for
preparing
error.
her report. She reviewed her photographs and video recordings, which clearly showed something unusual in the water, though the quality made it difficult to discern specific details. The evidence was there, but she knew it would raise more questions than it answered. She spent another hour carefully crafting her incident report, describing exactly what she had observed without speculating about what the object might have been. She included the exact time stamps, weather conditions, and her precise location on the ship when she made the observations. Sarah also noted the equipment she had used and attached the photographic evidence to support her account. When she finally submitted the report through proper channels at 0715 hours, Sarah felt confident that she had done everything correctly. She had followed protocol, documented everything thoroughly, and reported only what she had directly observed. In her 15 years of service, she had never filed a report that wasn't completely accurate, and she had no reason to think this one would be treated any differently. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells was the first to review Sarah's report when it reached the bridge that morning. Wells was known throughout the ship as a no-nonsense officer who valued precision and reliability above all else. She had worked with Sarah on numerous occasions and had always found her to be one of the most dependable members of the crew. But as Wells read through the incident report, her expression grew increasingly skeptical. The description of the object's movements seemed to violate basic principles of physics and naval engineering. The photographs, while intriguing, were inconclusive due to the distance and atmospheric conditions. Most troubling of all, none of the ship's sophisticated sonar or radar systems had detected anything unusual in the area where Sarah claimed to have seen the object. Wells called Sarah to her office that afternoon for a follow-up interview. The conversation was professional but pointed, with Wells asking detailed questions about Sarah's sleep patterns, stress levels, and general health. She also inquired about any medications Sarah might be taking and whether she had been experiencing any personal problems that might affect her judgment. Sarah answered all the questions honestly, maintaining that she had simply reported what she had observed. She acknowledged that the object's behavior was unusual and difficult to explain, but she insisted that her observations were accurate. When Wells suggested that she might have misidentified a known vessel or natural phenomenon, Sarah politely but firmly disagreed. Word of the unusual incident report began to spread throughout the ship within hours. The Navy is a small community, and news of anything out of the ordinary travels fast, especially when it involves claims of unidentified underwater objects. Some crew members were curious and supportive, asking Sarah for more details about what she had seen. Others were more skeptical, making jokes about sea monsters and alien submarines. By evening, Sarah began to sense a subtle shift in how her colleagues were treating her. Conversations seemed to stop when she entered a room, and she noticed some crew members exchanging meaningful glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The camaraderie that had always been one of the best parts of naval service began to feel strained and uncomfortable. Captain Richard Hawthorne, the ship's commanding officer, reviewed the incident report that evening in his quarters. Hawthorne was a career Navy officer with 22 years of experience and a reputation for running a tight ship. He had seen his share of unusual reports over the years, but this one troubled him for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. The problem wasn't that Sarah Martinez was unreliable, quite the opposite. She was one of the most trusted members of his crew, someone he had personally recommended for commendation on 2 previous occasions. The problem was that her report described something that simply couldn't exist, at least not according to everything Hawthorne knew about naval technology and underwater physics. Hawthorne called his executive officer, Commander David Chun, to discuss the situation. Chun had been equally puzzled by the report and had already begun making discreet inquiries about Sarah's recent performance and behavior. Both officers agreed that they needed to handle the situation carefully to protect both Sarah's reputation and the ship's operational security. The decision was made to classify the incident report and conduct a quiet internal investigation. They would review all the ship's sensor data from that morning, interview other crew members who were on duty, and have Sarah undergo a comprehensive medical examination. If there was a reasonable explanation for what she had seen, they would find it. If there wasn't, they would need to consider the possibility that one of their most reliable officers was experiencing some kind of breakdown. As Sarah lay in her bunk that night, she found herself replaying the morning's events over and over in her mind. She was absolutely certain of what she had seen, but the reactions of her superiors and colleagues were beginning to plant seeds of doubt. Could she have misinterpreted what she observed? Was it possible that stress or fatigue had affected her judgment in some way she wasn't aware of? But every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the object moving through the water with that impossible grace, defying every law of physics she had ever learned. She had the photographs and video recordings to prove that something had been there, even if they couldn't capture the full reality of what she had witnessed. Sarah had no way of knowing that her morning observation had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge not only her own career, but also force the Navy to confront questions about underwater surveillance, classified technology, and the possibility that not all secrets belong to human governments. The investigation that was about to begin would take her to places she never imagined and ultimately reveal truths that would change her life forever. As the USS Constellation continued its patrol through the dark Pacific waters, Sarah Martinez tried to sleep, unaware that her decision to report what she had seen would soon make her the center of the most controversial case in recent naval history. The truth she had witnessed that foggy morning was about to become her greatest challenge and, eventually, her most important victory. The investigation into Sarah's incident report began 3 days later with the arrival of a team of specialists from Naval Intelligence. Sarah first learned about their presence when she was called to Captain Hawthorne's office and found herself facing 3 officers she had never seen before, each wearing the crisp uniforms and serious expressions that marked them as people accustomed to dealing with sensitive matters. Commander Lisa Franklin led the investigation team. She was a tall, stern woman with graying hair and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of a person's appearance and demeanor. Her specialty was internal security investigations, and she had built her reputation by uncovering everything from espionage to fraud within naval ranks. Sitting beside her were Lieutenant Commander Mark Stevens, a technology specialist, and Dr. Rebecca Torres, a naval psychologist who had been brought in to assess Sarah's mental state. The interview lasted 4 hours and covered every aspect of Sarah's life, both professional and personal. Commander Franklin asked detailed questions about her family background, her financial situation, her relationships with fellow crew members, and any personal problems she might be experiencing. The questions were probing and sometimes uncomfortably personal, but Sarah answered them honestly, maintaining her composure despite growing frustration with the direction of the inquiry. Dr. Torres conducted a separate psychological evaluation that included a battery of tests designed to assess Sarah's mental health, cognitive functioning, and ability to accurately perceive and report events. The tests were thorough and exhausting, covering everything from memory recall to stress responses to potential substance abuse issues. Throughout it all, Sarah cooperated fully, understanding that her credibility and career were at stake. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Stevens was conducting a technical analysis of all the ship's electronic systems for the time period when Sarah claimed to have made her observation. He reviewed sonar logs, radar data, and communications intercepts, looking for any evidence that might corroborate or contradict Sarah's account. The absence of any corresponding readings on the ship's sophisticated detection equipment was particularly troubling to the investigation team. The preliminary results of the investigation were not encouraging for Sarah. The psychological evaluation found her to be mentally stable and competent, which should have been good news, but it also meant that the investigators couldn't attribute her report to any obvious mental health issues. The technical analysis revealed no anomalous readings on any of the ship's sensors during the time in question, suggesting that whatever Sarah thought she had seen had either been invisible to electronic detection or had never existed at all. Commander Franklin's background investigation into Sarah's personal life yielded some concerning details that she hadn't anticipated. Sarah's younger brother, Miguel, had been struggling with substance abuse problems, and Sarah had been sending him money regularly to help with his treatment costs. Her mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease 6 months earlier, adding emotional and financial stress to Sarah's life. While neither of these circumstances was unusual or disqualifying, they painted a picture of someone under significant personal pressure. The investigation team also discovered that Sarah had been working longer hours than regulations technically permitted, often volunteering for extra shifts to help cover for crew members who were sick or on leave. While this dedication was admirable, it raised questions about whether fatigue might have impaired her judgment on the morning she made her observation. As word of the investigation spread throughout the naval community, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. Fellow crew members who had previously sought her out for advice or casual conversation began keeping their distance. She understood their reluctance to associate with someone who was under investigation, but the loneliness was harder to bear than she had expected. The situation became more complicated when other crew members began reporting their own unusual observations. Seaman Third Class Tommy Rodriguez claimed to have seen strange lights beneath the water surface on 2 different occasions, though he admitted he hadn't reported them because he thought they were probably bioluminescent sea life. Petty Officer Janet Kim mentioned noticing unusual sonar readings that lasted for just a few seconds before disappearing, but she had dismissed them as equipment glitches. These additional reports should have supported Sarah's credibility, but instead they seemed to fuel more suspicion within the investigation team. Commander Franklin began questioning whether there might be some kind of group delusion or coordinated effort to fabricate evidence. The possibility that multiple crew members might be experiencing similar hallucinations raised even more troubling questions about the ship's operational readiness and the crew's mental health. Dr. Torres expanded her evaluation to include the other crew members who had reported unusual observations. Her findings were puzzling. All of them appeared to be mentally stable, competent individuals with no history of psychological problems or substance abuse. Their accounts, while different in specifics, shared common elements that suggested they might have observed the same phenomenon from different perspectives. The investigation took a more serious turn when Lieutenant Commander Stevens made a disturbing discovery in his technical analysis. While reviewing archived sonar data from the past 6 months, he found several instances of brief, inexplicable readings that had been automatically logged by the ship systems but never investigated. The readings were subtle and lasted only seconds, but they showed patterns that were consistent with large objects moving underwater at speeds and depths that shouldn't have been possible for known technology. This discovery forced the investigation team to consider the possibility that Sarah and the other crew members had actually observed something real, even if they couldn't explain what it was. The implications were troubling for everyone involved. If there were unknown objects operating in waters under U.S. naval surveillance, it represented a potential security threat of the highest order. Commander Franklin found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to balance multiple competing interests. On one hand, she needed to determine whether Sarah Martinez was a reliable observer whose reports could be trusted. On the other hand, she was beginning to uncover evidence of something that might require involvement from much higher levels of command, possibly including naval intelligence and national security agencies. The investigation expanded to include a review of classified naval records and intelligence reports from the past 5 years. This research revealed a pattern that was both fascinating and deeply concerning. There had been dozens of similar reports from naval personnel around the world describing underwater objects that exhibited characteristics beyond known technology. Most of these reports have been classified and quietly filed away without further investigation. Sarah learned about this broader pattern of reports when Commander Franklin called her for a follow-up interview. For the first time since the investigation began, Franklin's attitude seemed less adversarial and more genuinely curious about what Sarah had experienced. The commander explained that Sarah's report was not isolated and asked her to provide even more detailed descriptions of what she had observed. This revelation was both vindicating and terrifying for Sarah. She felt validated that other trained naval personnel had seen similar phenomena, but she was also disturbed to learn that such reports had apparently been suppressed or ignored. If these sightings represented some kind of security threat, why hadn't more resources been devoted to investigating them? The investigation team's final report was submitted to Pacific Fleet Command 3 weeks after it began. The document was carefully worded and diplomatically ambiguous, concluding that while Sarah Martinez appeared to be a credible observer who had genuinely believed she witnessed something unusual, the evidence was insufficient to determine what, if anything, she had actually seen. The report recommended continued monitoring of the crew members' performance and suggested that the broader pattern of similar reports warranted further investigation at higher classification levels. For Sarah, this conclusion felt like a hollow victory. She had been cleared of any wrongdoing, but her account had not been validated either. She was allowed to return to her regular duties, but the atmosphere aboard ship remained tense and uncomfortable. Many of her colleagues still viewed her with suspicion, wondering whether she had somehow fabricated her story or was experiencing psychological problems that the doctors had failed to detect. Captain Hawthorne called Sarah to his office the day after the investigation concluded. He was more sympathetic than she had expected, acknowledging the difficult position she had been placed in and expressing appreciation for her cooperation throughout the process. However, he also made it clear that any future reports of unusual observations would need to be extraordinarily well documented and corroborated by other witnesses. The conversation was professional, but carried an undercurrent of warning. While Sarah had been cleared of any misconduct, her credibility had been damaged, and another controversial report could end her career. The captain's message was clear. Whatever she thought she had seen that foggy morning, it would be better for everyone if she never saw anything like it again. Sarah left the captain's office feeling frustrated and misunderstood. She had done exactly what her training and her conscience had required, reporting accurately what she had observed. The fact that the observation was unusual and difficult to explain shouldn't have made her the subject of suspicion and investigation. She began to wonder whether the Navy she had served faithfully for 15 years was really the institution she thought she knew. As the USS Constellation continued its patrol operations, Sarah tried to resume her normal routine, but everything felt different now. She found herself second-guessing her own perceptions and hesitating to report even routine observations. The confidence and decisiveness that had made her an excellent communications specialist had been shaken by weeks of having her judgment questioned and her credibility challenged. Unknown to Sarah or anyone else aboard the ship, her incident report had attracted attention from levels of command that she couldn't have imagined. Deep within the Pentagon, a small group of officers and civilian analysts have been quietly tracking reports like hers for decades, building a database of observations that painted a picture of underwater activity that defied conventional explanation. Admiral James Morrison was one of the few people with access to this classified information. A veteran of 40 years in the Navy, Morrison had seen enough unusual reports cross his desk to know that Sarah Martinez's observation was part of a much larger puzzle. Unlike the investigation team that had questioned Sarah's credibility, Morrison was more interested in understanding what these reports might mean and why they were becoming more frequent. The Admiral had been quietly building a case for a more systematic investigation of these underwater anomalies, but he needed more evidence and more credible witnesses. Sarah's report, combined with the corroborating sensor data that the investigation had uncovered, represented exactly the kind of documented case he had been looking for. Morrison began making discreet inquiries about Sarah's background and service record. What he found impressed him. She was exactly the kind of reliable, professional observer whose testimony could withstand scrutiny from skeptics and critics. If he was going to convince his superiors to take these reports seriously, he would need witnesses like Sarah Martinez to make his case. But first, he would need to protect her from the career damage that had already been done and restore her credibility within the naval community. That would require careful maneuvering within the Pentagon's complex political landscape and a willingness to challenge officers who prefer to dismiss uncomfortable reports rather than investigate them. As Sarah struggled with the aftermath of her investigation, she had no idea that her courage in reporting what she had seen was about to attract the attention of someone with the power and determination to find the truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be for the Navy's leadership. Admiral James Morrison had been following unusual underwater reports for the better part of 2 decades, ever since a young lieutenant commander named Morrison had first encountered something inexplicable during a submarine patrol in the North Atlantic. Back then, he had made the same mistake that so many naval officers made when faced with the impossible. He had convinced himself that he must have been mistaken, that there had to be a rational explanation for what he had witnessed. Now, 20 years later, and with 4 stars on his shoulder, Morrison had access to classified files that painted a very different picture. The reports weren't isolated incidents by confused or unreliable personnel. They formed a pattern that suggested something significant was happening in the world's oceans, something that the Navy's leadership had chosen to ignore rather than investigate. Sarah Martinez's case came to Morrison's attention through a routine intelligence briefing that included summaries of all unusual incident reports from Pacific Fleet operations. The details of her observation matched dozens of similar reports in Morrison's classified files. But what set her case apart was the quality of the investigation that had followed. Unlike most such reports, which were quickly dismissed or buried, Sarah's had generated extensive documentation, technical analysis, and even corroborating sensor data. Morrison requested the complete investigation file and spent several hours reviewing every document, photograph, and interview transcript. He was particularly interested in the technical analysis conducted by Lieutenant Commander Stevens, which had uncovered those brief sonar anomalies from previous months. This was exactly the kind of objective evidence that Morrison had been hoping someone would eventually discover. The Admiral was also impressed by Sarah's conduct throughout the investigation. Her responses to questioning had been consistent, professional, and detailed without being embellished. She had maintained her account even under significant pressure and skepticism from investigators, which suggested either remarkable dedication to a fabricated story or genuine confidence in what she had observed. Morrison made a decision that would prove crucial for both Sarah's career and his own long-term investigation into these underwater phenomena. He requested a transfer for Sarah Martinez to his staff at Pacific Fleet Command in San Diego, ostensibly for a routine assignment in strategic communications. The transfer would remove her from the uncomfortable situation aboard the USS Constellation and put her in a position where Morrison could evaluate her firsthand. The transfer orders arrived 6 weeks after Sarah's investigation concluded, surprising everyone involved, including Sarah herself. Transfers to Pacific Fleet Command were typically reserved for officers with exemplary records who were being groomed for advancement. Given the recent controversy surrounding her incident report, Sarah had expected her career prospects to be diminished rather than enhanced. Captain Hawthorne was equally puzzled by the transfer orders. He had submitted a routine performance evaluation for Sarah that was positive but unremarkable, making no mention of the unusual incident that had dominated recent months aboard his ship. The fact that someone at Fleet Command had specifically requested Sarah's assignment suggested that her case had attracted attention at levels far above his own authority. Sarah reported to Pacific Fleet Command on a sunny Monday morning in October, still uncertain about why she had been selected for this assignment. The headquarters building was imposing and bustling with activity, a stark contrast to the relatively intimate environment of ship life. She was directed to Admiral Morrison's outer office, where his aide, Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, explained that the Admiral wanted to personally brief all new staff members. When Sarah finally met Admiral Morrison, she was struck by his calm, thoughtful demeanor. Unlike the intense scrutiny she had experienced during her investigation, Morrison's questions were genuinely curious rather than suspicious. He asked about her background, her training, and her experience with the communication systems that would be part of her new assignment. Only toward the end of their conversation did he mention her recent incident report. Morrison's approach was careful and diplomatic. He acknowledged that she had been through a difficult experience and expressed appreciation for her professionalism in handling the investigation. Then, almost casually, he mentioned that unusual observations by naval personnel were more common than most people realized, and that such reports were often mishandled by commanders who lacked the proper context to evaluate them. For Sarah, this was the first time since her observation that anyone in authority had suggested her experience might be legitimate. Morrison didn't explicitly validate her account, but his tone and manner implied that he took such reports seriously rather than dismissing them as impossible or fabricated. It was a subtle but significant shift from the skepticism and suspicion she had grown accustomed to. Morrison assigned Sarah to a position in the Strategic Communications Division, where her primary responsibility would be analyzing and organizing intelligence reports from naval units throughout the Pacific. The work was interesting and challenging, requiring her to synthesize information from multiple sources and identify patterns that might not be obvious to individual observers. What Sarah didn't initially realize was that Morrison had specifically designed her assignment to expose her to the broader pattern of unusual underwater reports that had been accumulating in classified files for years. As she worked through intelligence summaries and incident reports, she began to notice recurring themes that were disturbingly familiar. There were reports from submarine crews describing objects that moved underwater at impossible speeds and depths. Surface vessels reported sonar contacts that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Coastal monitoring stations recorded acoustic signatures that didn't match any known marine life or human technology. Most troubling of all, The frequency of such reports appeared to be increasing steadily over the past decade. Sarah found herself working longer hours than required, drawn into the puzzle by professional curiosity and personal vindication. The more reports she read, the more convinced she became that her own observation had been part of something much larger and more significant than anyone had been willing to acknowledge. Admiral Morrison watched Sarah's progress carefully, noting her dedication to the work and her apparent recognition of the patterns in the data. He began including her in higher-level briefings where these unusual reports were discussed in the context of broader naval intelligence concerns. Sarah proved to be exactly the kind of analyst he had hoped: thorough, objective, and unafraid to draw conclusions that might be uncomfortable for her superiors. 3 months into her assignment, Morrison called Sarah to his private office for what he described as a classified briefing. The conversation that followed would change both of their careers and ultimately lead to the most significant investigation in modern naval history. Morrison began by acknowledging that he knew exactly why Sarah had been investigated aboard the USS Constellation and that he had specifically requested her transfer because of, not in spite of, her controversial incident report. He explained that the Navy had been accumulating similar reports for decades, but had never committed the resources necessary to investigate them systematically. The Admiral then did something unprecedented. He showed Sarah a selection of classified files containing reports remarkably similar to her own. There were accounts from all over the world, dating back to the 1970s, describing underwater objects with characteristics that defied conventional explanation. Many of the observers were highly trained, experienced personnel with exemplary service records, yet their reports had been consistently dismissed or suppressed. Morrison explained that he had been quietly building a case for a formal investigation into these phenomena for several years, but he needed more evidence and more credible witnesses to convince the Navy's leadership to take the matter seriously. Sarah's case represented exactly the kind of well-documented, thoroughly investigated incident that could serve as a foundation for broader inquiry. The Admiral's proposal was both exciting and daunting. He wanted Sarah to help him compile a comprehensive analysis of all similar reports, identifying patterns and correlations that might point toward explanations for what naval personnel were observing. More importantly, he wanted her to help him design a systematic investigation that could finally determine what was really happening in the world's oceans. Sarah agreed without hesitation. For the first time since her original observation, she felt that someone in authority was taking the matter seriously and was committed to finding the truth rather than simply making the problem disappear. The work would be challenging and potentially controversial, but it represented exactly the kind of meaningful assignment she had hoped for when she first joined the Navy. Morrison assembled a small team of trusted analysts and technical specialists to work on what became known internally as Project Deep Look. Sarah was designated as the primary intelligence analyst, responsible for collecting and organizing all relevant reports from naval databases around the world. The team also included Dr. Michael Chun, an oceanographer and sonar specialist, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Reeves, an expert in underwater acoustics, and Commander Robert Hayes, a former submarine captain with extensive experience in deep-water operations. The team worked in a secure facility within Pacific Fleet Command, with access to classified databases and communication channels that allowed them to request information from naval units worldwide. Their mission was to conduct a comprehensive analysis of unusual underwater observations and determine whether the reports represented genuine phenomena that warranted official investigation. What they discovered over the following months was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The pattern of reports was far more extensive than Morrison had initially realized, with documented observations from every major ocean and numerous inland bodies of water. The objects described in these reports exhibited characteristics that were consistent across different times, locations, and observers, suggesting that whatever was being seen was real and followed identifiable patterns. Dr. Chin's analysis of sonar and acoustic data revealed signatures that were unlike anything in the Navy's databases of known marine life or human technology. The acoustic profiles suggested objects of substantial size, moving at speeds that should have created massive turbulence and noise, yet the recording showed remarkably little disturbance to the surrounding water. Lieutenant Commander Reeves' work on underwater acoustics provided even more puzzling evidence. She identified recordings of what appeared to be structured sounds emanating from the areas where visual sightings had been reported. The sounds had characteristics that suggested artificial origin, but they didn't match any known communication protocols or mechanical signatures. Commander Hayes brought his submarine experience to bear on the question of whether the reported maneuvers could be achieved by any known underwater technology. His analysis was unequivocal. The speeds, depths, and turning capabilities described in the reports were beyond anything that human engineering had achieved, even in the most advanced military submarines. As the evidence accumulated, Morrison faced a decision that would define the remainder of his career. The data clearly indicated that something significant was happening in the world's oceans, something that represented either a revolutionary advancement in underwater technology by an unknown party or phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible in marine environments. The Admiral knew that presenting this evidence to his superiors would be professionally risky. The Navy's leadership had consistently chosen to ignore or dismiss such reports, and challenging that institutional position could damage his own credibility and career prospects. However, Morrison also understood that his duty as a naval officer required him to investigate potential threats to national security, regardless of how uncomfortable the investigation might be for his colleagues. Morrison decided to prepare a comprehensive briefing for the Chief of Naval Operations, presenting the accumulated evidence and requesting authorization for a formal investigation with appropriate resources and personnel. The briefing would include Sarah's original incident report as a case study, demonstrating how a credible observation had been mishandled by an investigative process that assumed the observer must be mistaken rather than genuinely examining the evidence. For Sarah, the months of work on Project Deep Look had been both vindicating and overwhelming. The evidence clearly supported her original observation and suggested that she had been part of discovering something of potentially enormous significance. At the same time, she was beginning to understand the institutional resistance that had led to her investigation and the suppression of similar reports throughout naval history. The team's final report ran to over 300 pages and included detailed analysis of more than 400 unusual underwater observations from the previous 20 years. The evidence was compelling and thoroughly documented, but Morrison knew that presenting it would require careful consideration of politics and timing within the Navy's complex command structure. As Admiral Morrison prepared for what might be the most important briefing of his career, Sarah continued her analysis work, uncovering new patterns and correlations that painted an increasingly clear picture of organized underwater activity that defied conventional explanation. Neither of them could have predicted how dramatically their investigation was about to expand or the personal cost they would face in pursuing the truth. Admiral Morrison's briefing to Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Catherine Richardson was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December, exactly 1 year after Sarah Martinez had first reported her unusual observation. Morrison had spent weeks preparing his presentation, knowing that this would likely be his only opportunity to convince the Navy's leadership to take the matter seriously. The briefing took place in a secure conference room deep within the Pentagon, attended by Admiral Richardson, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Thomas Brooks, and Director of Naval Intelligence Rear Admiral Sarah Parker. Morrison had specifically requested that Sarah Martinez be present to provide first-hand testimony about her experience, marking the first time she had been asked to discuss her observation with officers at this level. Morrison began his presentation with a comprehensive overview of Project Deep Look's findings, methodically laying out the evidence that his team had accumulated over the past year. He presented the data without speculation or sensationalism, focusing on documented facts and patterns that could be verified through official records. The scope of the evidence was impressive. Hundreds of reports from credible observers, corroborating sensor data, and analysis that clearly indicated organized underwater activity of unknown origin. Admiral Richardson listened to the briefing with the professional skepticism that had characterized her rise through naval ranks. She had heard unusual reports before and understood the tendency of personnel to misinterpret natural phenomena or equipment malfunctions. However, Morrison's presentation was different from the typical UFO or sea monster reports that occasionally crossed her desk. The evidence was systematic, thoroughly analyzed, and came from sources she knew to be reliable. When Morrison called upon Sarah to describe her original observation, she found herself facing the same kind of intense scrutiny she had experienced during her investigation aboard the USS Constellation. However, this time the questions were focused on gathering information rather than challenging her credibility. Admiral Richardson asked detailed questions about the object's movement patterns, size estimates, and the environmental conditions that might have affected Sarah's observations. Sarah's testimony was clear, detailed, and professionally delivered. She acknowledged the limitations of her observations while maintaining confidence in the accuracy of what she had reported. Her obvious competence and credibility made a strong impression on the senior officers, who had expected to encounter someone who might be prone to exaggeration or fantasy. The most compelling part of Morrison's briefing came when he presented the technical analysis conducted by his team. Dr. Chin's sonar data analysis revealed acoustic signatures that were consistent across multiple incidents and locations, suggesting that whatever was being observed followed identifiable patterns rather than representing random misidentifications. Lieutenant Commander Reeves' acoustic analysis had identified structured sounds that appeared to be some form of communication or coordination between the observed objects. Commander Hayes' technical assessment was perhaps the most troubling element of the briefing. His analysis demonstrated conclusively that the maneuvers described in numerous reports were beyond the capabilities of any known underwater technology, including the most advanced military submarines operated by any nation. The speeds, depths, and turning capabilities suggested propulsion and engineering principles that were not part of current human technology. Admiral Richardson called for a brief recess to consult privately with her colleagues. The conversation that followed was intense and sometimes heated, with Admiral Brooks expressing skepticism about the entire premise of the investigation, while Admiral Parker acknowledged that the evidence presented legitimate security concerns that warranted further examination. When the briefing resumed, Admiral Richardson asked the question that Morrison had been expecting. What did he believe the evidence indicated? Morrison's response was carefully measured, acknowledging that the data suggested underwater activity by objects using technology that was not currently understood or possessed by any known human organization. He stopped short of speculating about the ultimate origin of the objects, but emphasized that the pattern of observations represented a potential security issue that required systematic investigation. The briefing concluded with Admiral Richardson requesting a detailed proposal for expanded investigation, including resource requirements and potential security implications. She made it clear that any such investigation would need to be conducted with the highest level of classification and that the findings would be closely controlled to prevent premature disclosure or public speculation. For Sarah, the briefing represented a remarkable vindication of her original decision to report what she had observed. After months of doubt and professional isolation, she found herself at the center of what might become one of the most significant investigations in naval history. The senior officers had treated her testimony with respect and had clearly been impressed by the thoroughness of the analysis that had grown from her initial report. Morrison was authorized to expand Project Deep Look into a formal investigation with significantly increased resources and personnel. The new operation, designated Project Deep Blue, would have access to advanced monitoring equipment, additional analytical staff, and coordination with intelligence agencies that had been tracking similar phenomena. Morrison was given broad authority to investigate the underwater observations and determine their nature and potential security implications. Sarah was promoted to lieutenant commander and designated as the primary intelligence coordinator for Project Deep Blue, responsible for managing the flow of information between various naval units and intelligence agencies. Her new position represented not only professional advancement, but also official recognition that her contributions to the investigation were valued and essential. The expanded investigation began with the deployment of specialized monitoring equipment to areas where unusual underwater activity had been most frequently reported. Advanced sonar arrays, underwater microphones, and optical sensors were positioned throughout the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, creating a comprehensive surveillance network designed to detect and track any objects exhibiting the characteristics described in previous reports. Within 6 months, Project Deep Blue had collected evidence that exceeded even Morrison's expectations. The monitoring equipment detected numerous objects moving underwater at speeds and depths that confirmed the reports from human observers. More significantly, the sensors recorded what appeared to be coordinated movement patterns, suggesting that the objects were operating under some form of intelligent control. Dr. Chin's analysis of the new sensor data revealed acoustic signatures that were unlike anything in existing databases. The objects produced sounds that appeared to be structured communications, with patterns that suggested a sophisticated language or coordination system. Most remarkably, the acoustic analysis indicated that the objects were aware of the Navy's monitoring efforts and had begun altering their behavior in response to the surveillance. This discovery led to a troubling realization. Whatever was operating in the world's oceans was not only technologically advanced, but was also actively monitoring human naval activities. The objects appeared to be studying human underwater technology and operations with the same intensity that the Navy was now applying to studying them. Lieutenant Commander Reeves made perhaps the most significant breakthrough when she detected what appeared to be attempts at communication directed specifically toward the Navy's monitoring stations. The signals were clearly artificial and followed mathematical patterns that suggested an intelligence trying to establish contact. The implications were both fascinating and terrifying, suggesting that the object's operators were aware of human efforts to study them and were attempting to initiate some form of dialogue. Admiral Morrison faced an unprecedented decision. The evidence clearly indicated that the underwater objects represented an intelligence that was not human in origin, yet was capable of advanced technology and appeared to be attempting communication. The discovery had implications far beyond naval security, potentially representing the first confirmed contact with non-human intelligence. Morrison briefed Admiral Richardson on these developments in a series of highly classified meetings that included representatives from the CIA, NSA, and other intelligence agencies. The revelation that the underwater objects might represent extraterrestrial intelligence created enormous controversy within the government, with some officials arguing for immediate disclosure, while others insisted on continued secrecy until the nature and intentions of the intelligence could be determined. Sarah found herself at the center of these extraordinary developments, working with linguists, mathematicians, and communication specialists to analyze the apparent attempts at contact from the underwater intelligences. The signals were complex and structured, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and physics, but they also contained elements that were completely incomprehensible to human analysis. The investigation took a dramatic turn when one of the monitoring stations recorded what appeared to be a deliberate approach by one of the objects. Unlike previous observations, which had involved distant sightings and brief sensor contacts, this incident involved an object that approached within a few hundred meters of the monitoring equipment and remained in the area for several hours. During this extended contact, the object produced a series of acoustic signals that were clearly directed toward the monitoring station. The signals included mathematical sequences, repetitions of previously recorded Navy sonar signatures, and what appear to be attempts to reproduce human language patterns. The message was unmistakable. The intelligence operating the object was trying to communicate, and was demonstrating its awareness of human technology and activities. Sarah worked with the communication team to develop response protocols for future contact attempts. The challenge was enormous. How do you communicate with an intelligence that might have completely different cognitive structures and communication methods? The team developed a series of mathematical and acoustic signals designed to demonstrate human intelligence while inviting further communication. The first successful exchange occurred on a clear morning in June, exactly 18 months after Sarah's original observation. One of the objects approached a monitoring station and produced the expected mathematical sequences. When the station responded with the predetermined signals, the object immediately replied with increasingly complex mathematical progressions, confirming that genuine two-way communication had been established. Admiral Morrison realized that Project Deep Blue had evolved far beyond its original scope. The investigation had uncovered evidence of non-human intelligence actively operating on Earth and attempting to establish communication with human governments. The implications were staggering, potentially affecting everything from national security to humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The decision was made to expand the communication efforts while maintaining absolute secrecy about the discoveries. A new facility was constructed specifically for managing contact with the underwater intelligences, staffed by experts in mathematics, linguistics, physics, and psychology. Sarah was assigned as the primary military liaison for the communication project, responsible for ensuring that naval interests were represented in any ongoing dialogue. As the communication efforts progressed, it became clear that the underwater intelligences had been observing human activities for decades, possibly centuries. They possessed detailed knowledge of human technology, culture, and history, suggesting that their interest in humanity was long-standing and comprehensive. Most remarkably, they appeared to be peaceful in their intentions, showing no signs of hostility despite their obvious technological superiority. Sarah often reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her decision to report an unusual observation 18 months earlier. Her courage in speaking the truth, despite institutional skepticism and personal costs, had led to the discovery of non-human intelligence and the beginning of what might be the most important communication in human history. Admiral Morrison's willingness to investigate rather than dismiss uncomfortable evidence had transformed what could have been a career-ending controversy into a discovery of unprecedented significance. The investigation had vindicated Sarah's original observation while revealing truths about the universe that would challenge humanity's fundamental assumptions about its place in the cosmos. As Project Deep Blue continued to expand and evolve, Sarah and Morrison knew that they were participating in events that would ultimately change human understanding of the universe. The underwater intelligences represented not only a technological mystery, but also a profound opportunity to learn about life beyond Earth and humanity's potential future among the stars. 2 years after Sarah Martinez first raised her binoculars to scan the Pacific horizon, she stood in a state-of-the-art communication facility that hadn't existed when her journey began. The room hummed with advanced equipment designed specifically for maintaining contact with intelligences that had chosen Earth's oceans as their temporary home. Through a series of extraordinary developments, Sarah had gone from being suspected of fabricating stories to serving as humanity's primary liaison with visitors from another world. The breakthrough that changed everything had come 6 months earlier, when the underwater intelligences finally provided clear information about their origins and intentions. Through a combination of mathematical formulas, acoustic patterns, and eventually crude visual representations, they had explained that they were explorers from a distant star system who had been studying Earth's oceans for over 3 centuries. Their technology was based on principles that human science was only beginning to understand, involving the manipulation of gravity and electromagnetic fields to achieve propulsion that appeared to defy conventional physics. Their underwater vessels weren't ships in the traditional sense, but rather mobile habitats that allowed them to exist in Earth's environment while conducting their research. Dr. Chun had been working with the visitors to understand their propulsion technology, making discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of physics and engineering. The acoustic signatures that had puzzled naval analysts for years were actually byproducts of their gravity manipulation systems, creating distinctive sound patterns as they moved through water at impossible speeds. The visitors explained that they had chosen to operate underwater because the oceans provided a relatively isolated environment where they could conduct their studies without interfering with human civilization. They had been observing Earth's development for generations, watching as human technology progressed from sailing ships to nuclear submarines, always maintaining a careful distance to avoid detection. What had changed in recent years was the dramatic improvement in human sensor technology. Naval sonar systems had become sophisticated enough to detect their presence, and the increasing frequency of human underwater activities had made it impossible to remain completely hidden. Rather than leave Earth or risk accidental contact that could cause panic, they had decided to attempt controlled communication with human governments. Sarah's observation 18 months earlier had been part of their deliberate strategy to initiate contact. The visitors had been monitoring human naval communications and had identified her as a competent, reliable observer whose report would be taken seriously by her superiors. They had deliberately revealed themselves to her, hoping that her account would eventually lead to systematic investigation rather than immediate dismissal. The visitors' patience and careful planning had been vindicated by the professional response that Admiral Morrison had organized. Rather than the panic or aggressive reaction they had feared from human governments, they had found partners who were genuinely interested in peaceful communication and scientific exchange. Through their ongoing dialogue, Sarah had learned that the visitors represented a civilization that had been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years, studying developing worlds and documenting the emergence of intelligence throughout the universe. Earth was considered particularly interesting because human technology was advancing rapidly, while human society was simultaneously facing challenges that would determine whether the species would survive to join the galactic community. The visitors had observed similar developmental patterns on dozens of worlds throughout the galaxy. Some civilizations successfully navigated their technological adolescence and became members of a loose confederation of exploring species. Others destroyed themselves through warfare, environmental destruction, or social collapse before achieving the stability necessary for interstellar civilization. Earth was at a critical juncture in this developmental process. Human technology had advanced to the point where the species could either destroy itself or transcend its planetary limitations, but the outcome was still uncertain. The visitors had decided to make themselves known because they believed that contact with an established galactic civilization might help guide humanity toward a positive outcome. Admiral Morrison had been briefed on these revelations during a series of meetings that included the president, key members of Congress, and senior officials from multiple government agencies. The decision had been made to maintain secrecy about the contact while establishing formal communication protocols and beginning the process of preparing humanity for eventual disclosure. Sarah found herself at the center of the most significant secret in human history. Her daily work involved facilitating communication between the visitors and human scientists, helping to translate concepts between species that had evolved under completely different conditions. The visitors' mathematics was similar enough to human mathematics to enable communication, but their science was based on principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The most remarkable aspect of the ongoing contact was the visitors' genuine interest in human welfare. They had made it clear that they posed no threat to humanity and had no interest in Earth's resources or territory. Their exploration was driven purely by scientific curiosity and a desire to document the development of intelligence throughout the galaxy. They had offered to share selected technological advances that could help humanity address pressing challenges like climate change and energy production, but they insisted that such sharing must be gradual and carefully managed to avoid disrupting human social development. They had observed other worlds where rapid technological advancement had led to social collapse and were determined to avoid repeating those mistakes on Earth. Sarah often reflected on the irony that her career-threatening controversy had led to the most extraordinary opportunity in human history. The investigation that had initially questioned her competence and reliability had ultimately placed her at the forefront of humanity's first contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. The Navy colleagues who had once viewed her with suspicion now sought her advice on matters that would affect the future of human civilization. Admiral Morrison's courage in pursuing the investigation despite institutional resistance had proven even more significant than either of them had imagined. His willingness to challenge conventional thinking and examine uncomfortable evidence had led to discoveries that would eventually transform human understanding of the universe and humanity's place within it. The communication project had expanded to include scientists and scholars from around the world, working under the highest levels of security clearance to study the visitor's technology and prepare for eventual public disclosure. Sarah had been promoted to commander and designated as the Director of Extraterrestrial Liaison, a position that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. The visitors had provided a timeline for gradual disclosure that would span several years, allowing human societies to adjust slowly to the reality of extraterrestrial contact. The process would begin with carefully controlled revelations to the scientific community, followed by gradual disclosure to world governments, and eventually full public acknowledgement of the visitor's presence. Sarah was working with communication specialists to develop public education programs that would help prepare humanity for this revelation. The challenge was enormous. How do you tell the world that extraterrestrial visitors have been studying Earth for centuries without causing panic or social disruption? The visitors' experience with other worlds provided valuable guidance, but every civilization was unique, and human reactions would ultimately depend on how well the disclosure process was managed. The visitors had already begun sharing selected technologies that would become humanity's first tangible benefits from the contact. Advanced materials science, new approaches to energy production, and medical technologies were being quietly introduced through carefully managed research programs. The developments would appear to be natural advances in human science, but they were actually guided by knowledge gained from contact with a civilization thousands of years more advanced. Dr. Chun was leading a team of physicists in studying the visitor's propulsion technology, work that would eventually revolutionize human space travel and make interstellar exploration possible. The gravity manipulation principles that powered the visitors' underwater vessels could also be applied to spacecraft, potentially allowing humanity to join the galactic community within generations rather than millennia. Lieutenant Commander Reeves had been working with the visitors to develop new communication technologies based on their acoustic systems. The applications were staggering, from improved underwater communication to new forms of data transmission that could operate across interstellar distances. Commander Hayes had been amazed to learn that the visitors' underwater operations were actually more challenging than their interstellar travel. Water was a more difficult medium to navigate than space, and the visitors' ability to operate seamlessly in Earth's oceans represented some of their most advanced technological achievements. As Sarah prepared for another communication session with the visitors, she often thought about the young communications officer who had raised binoculars on a foggy Pacific morning 2 years earlier. That woman had been focused on routine duties and career advancement, with no idea that she was about to become part of the most important discovery in human history. The decision to report what she had seen, despite knowing it would be controversial and potentially damaging to her career, had required exactly the kind of courage and integrity that would be essential for humanity's successful transition to membership in the galactic community. The visitors had been observing human behavior for centuries, and they had specifically chosen to reveal themselves to someone who demonstrated these qualities. Admiral Morrison's investigation had proven that the Navy's institutional culture, despite its tendency towards skepticism and conformity, was capable of adapting to extraordinary circumstances when led by officers who prioritized truth over convenience. The success of Project Deep Blue had led to broader changes in how the military approached unusual reports and scientific investigation. The communication facility where Sarah now worked represented humanity's first diplomatic mission to an extraterrestrial civilization. The protocols being developed for contact with the visitors would eventually serve as models for communication with other species that humanity would encounter as it expanded into the galaxy. The visitors had mentioned that several other civilizations were currently active in exploring this region of the galaxy, and contact with these species would be inevitable as human technology continued to advance. The relationship being established with the current visitors would determine how these future contacts would unfold, and whether humanity would be welcomed as a promising new member of the galactic community or viewed as a potentially dangerous species requiring careful monitoring. Sarah's role in these historic developments had transformed her from a competent but unremarkable naval officer into one of the most important humans of her generation. Her courage in reporting the truth, even when no one believed her, had initiated a chain of events that would ultimately change the course of human civilization. Admiral Morrison's willingness to investigate rather than dismiss uncomfortable evidence had proven that military leadership could adapt to extraordinary circumstances while maintaining the discipline and professionalism that made such adaptation possible. Together, they had demonstrated that the human species possessed the qualities necessary for successful contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. As the communication session began, and Sarah prepared to facilitate another exchange between humanity and its first confirmed extraterrestrial visitors, she knew that the most extraordinary chapter of her story was still being written. The woman who had been accused of lying about an impossible observation had become the voice of humanity in its first conversation with the stars. The visitors had often expressed admiration for the courage it had taken for Sarah to report her observation despite institutional skepticism, noting that such integrity was essential for any species hoping to join the galactic community. They had observed many worlds where promising civilizations had failed to develop because individuals lacked the courage to speak uncomfortable truths or leaders lacked the wisdom to investigate challenging evidence. Sarah Martinez had proven that humanity possessed both the individual integrity and institutional adaptability necessary for successful contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. Her story had become an example of how one person's commitment to truth could change the course of history, transforming her from an accused liar into humanity's ambassador to the galaxy.